What happens when the lifeblood of the world's biggest economy is suddenly turned off, not by war, but by design? Oil isn't just fuel, it's power, it's leverage. It's the hidden thread that binds empires, ignites wars, and shapes the fate of nations. And right now, that thread is being pulled deliberately by a growing number of countries who've decided they've had enough of playing by Washington's economic rules. For decades, the United States has imposed tariffs, sanctions, and financial restrictions on countries it deemed out of line. It used its economic might like a weapon, often without facing serious retaliation. But something has changed. This time, nations are pushing back, not with missiles, not with diplomats, but with crude oil. In a dramatic shift that has left markets rattled and politicians scrambling, several oil-rich nations, some of them traditional foes of the US, to others former partners, have begun cutting off or reducing their oil exports to American refineries. And they're not doing it quietly. They're calling it retaliation, a direct answer to what they claim are unjust tariffs, economic coercion, and decades of being treated as pawns in a global energy game. The global oil market is no longer a one-way street where Washington calls the shots. Countries like Iran, Venezuela, and even Saudi Arabia are no longer whispering behind closed doors. They're acting in broad daylight, and the implications are massive. The timing is no accident. With geopolitical tensions running high and global supply chains still fragile from years of pandemic disruption, these countries are seizing the moment. They're using the very resource that has long fueled America's power to now shake its foundations. And it's not just about economics. This is deeply political. This is about pride, sovereignty, revenge. What we are witnessing is a strategic recalibration of global alliances, one where oil becomes a bargaining chip in a high-stakes game of global reordering. This is a coordinated message to Washington. If you keep raising tariffs and manipulating global trade, we'll hit you where it hurts most, your energy security. For the average American, this might feel distant, but the ripple effects are already reaching US. Soil, gas prices rising overnight, industries sounding the alarm, and whispers of inflation making a dangerous return. Behind closed doors in DC, policymakers are facing a terrifying question. What if the era of guaranteed oil flow is over? Oil embargoes aren't new, but the players this time are different. The motives more aligned, the consequences potentially far more destabilizing. In an era defined by shifting power dynamics, it's no longer unthinkable that a coalition of frustrated nations could band together to isolate the United States from critical resources, not through war, but through targeted economic pressure. This isn't a bluff. This is a real-time geopolitical shift, unfolding faster than most analysts predicted. And yet, many in the West remain dangerously unaware of the scale and significance of what's happening. The US government is trying to downplay the crisis, labeling it as temporary or manageable. But behind the scenes, there's panic. Because when countries start weaponizing oil in unison, it sends a chilling signal. The world is rebalancing, and America may no longer sit at the center. And here's where things get even more complicated, because this isn't just a headline, it's a chain reaction. One move from a key oil-exporting nation sends shockwaves through the global supply map. And every shockwave reaches you, at the pump, in your bills, and in the hidden costs of a world reshaping itself while we watch. So, what happens next? Could this be the beginning of a new economic Cold War, fought not with bombs, but with barrels? We're diving deep into the emerging oil retaliation movement, the rising alliances behind it, and how this new wave of energy warfare could impact not only the United States, but the balance of power for decades to come. But before we unpack what's really happening behind the scenes, I want to hear from you. Do you think oil should be used as a political weapon? Or is this kind of retaliation justified? Drop your take in the comments. We're building a community here that doesn't just consume content, we debate it. If you're into geopolitics, world power shifts, and real stories, the mainstream media won't break down like this. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding global drama. Now let's break down the oil shock, step by step. Sudden oil cut, a coordinated blow against Washington. It began like a tremor beneath the surface, quiet, barely noticeable. A few brief statements from energy ministers, a handful of delayed shipments, some diplomatic murmurs dismissed by analysts as noise. But what followed wasn't noise. It was a deliberate, carefully timed strike. Without warning, several nations made a synchronized move to reduce, and in some cases entirely halt, oil exports to the United States. This wasn't market fluctuation, it was retaliation. What made this moment different was the silence that came with it. There were no grandstanding speeches or dramatic press conferences, just a coordinated absence. Barrels that were supposed to arrive didn't. Tankers that should have departed remained docked. The signals were unmistakable for those who knew where to look. This was a strategic message, and it was written in crude oil. Washington, caught off guard, scrambled for explanations. Behind closed doors, intelligence reports warned that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening shot in a broader campaign. Iran had already been circumventing US sanctions by selling oil to China and India through shadow fleets. Venezuela, under heavy sanctions for years, found new strength by partnering with other ostracized nations. But now, these countries weren't just surviving, they were coordinating. And oil, their most valuable weapon, had officially been deployed. The headlines that followed used words like shock, unprecedented, and volatile. But those words didn't capture the deeper reality. This wasn't just about energy. This was a declaration. For decades, the United States used its financial system as a lever of control, cutting off nations from banking systems, freezing assets, and imposing tariffs to shape foreign behavior. Many countries resented it, but they lacked the unity and often the courage to push back. That era, it seems, has ended. This sudden oil cut was a demonstration of a new kind of coalition, a geopolitical alliance not formalized in treaties but forged in shared resentment and strategic necessity. Iran, Venezuela, Algeria, and even whispers of involvement from Saudi Arabia painted a picture far more dangerous than any singular embargo. The message was clear: economic pressure would now be met with economic pain. The White House was quick to call the move short-term and symbolic, but that downplayed the very real consequences. American refineries reliant on heavy crude faced immediate shortages. Prices spiked not just at gas stations, but across industries: aviation, shipping, agriculture. The markets were reacting not just to the loss of supply, but to the unknown. How far would this go? Who would join next? And what would Washington do in response? The deeper mystery, however, wasn't just who was behind the move, but how long they'd been planning it. Intelligence insiders later revealed that encrypted meetings between oil ministers from sanctioned nations had been taking place for months. A shared strategy was already in motion long before the first shipment was halted. This wasn't improvisation, it was coordination. And yet the mainstream media seemed reluctant to frame it for what it was: economic warfare. Perhaps because acknowledging it would mean recognizing that the US had lost a key element of control. Perhaps because the consequences were too uncomfortable to fully grasp. But behind the scenes, energy analysts and military strategists were already drawing up worst-case scenarios. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve could only hold off the crisis for so long. And if the retaliation spread, if larger producers joined, the US economy could be facing a disruption not seen since the oil shocks of the 1970s. But this time, it wouldn't be just an oil crisis. It would be a power crisis, a signal that the world was no longer afraid to bite back. The symbolism of the act cannot be overstated. Crude oil isn't just a commodity. It's a symbol of modern power. And for nations long bullied by sanctions, tariffs, and Western-imposed economic systems, cutting off oil was a way of reclaiming leverage. It wasn't just about hurting the US. It was about rewriting the rules. It was about saying, if you treat our economies like pawns, we will treat your economy like a target. Of course, the retaliation came with risk. These oil-producing nations still need customers. But here's where the geopolitical shift grows deeper. New buyers are emerging. China and India, two of the world's largest oil consumers, have begun ramping up purchases from countries under US sanctions, offering alternative markets and, in some cases, currency swaps that bypass the dollar entirely. That's not just bad news for American diplomacy. It's a signal that the dollar's grip on global trade is loosening. So the question is, was this just the first shot? Or is this a sustained campaign? And how far is Washington willing to go to regain control? This isn't just an energy story. This is a power story, a revenge story, and a strategic wake-up call for anyone paying attention to the shifting winds of global influence. What do you think? Is this retaliation justified or dangerous? Should oil be used as a geopolitical weapon? Comment below with one word: retaliation, if you believe it's fair, or escalation, if you think this will backfire. And if you're still here, you're clearly the kind of person who sees the big picture. So don't forget to like the video and subscribe for the next explosive chapter. The return of the Petro Alliance. What no one expected, at least not this soon, was how quickly old rivals would start finding common ground in the face of a shared enemy. Just months ago, the idea of Iran and Saudi Arabia aligning on anything would have sounded like geopolitical fiction. Their histories are marked by proxy conflicts, sectarian divisions, and decades of mutual suspicion. But now, under the surface of oil diplomacy, a new kind of logic is emerging, one shaped not by ideology, but by power, leverage, and the urgent need to break free from US-centered pressure. The return of what experts are calling a Petro Alliance isn't about formal treaties or flashy summits. It's about an understanding, unspoken yet unmistakable, that the weaponization of energy is no longer taboo. In fact, it's becoming the new norm. Oil has always been the silent currency of power, but now it's being spoken out loud, wielded not just to influence markets, but to shift political weight. The moment these nations recognize their shared frustration with US economic tactics, tariffs, sanctions, financial blockades, they began to see opportunity in unity. Behind closed doors, energy ministers and state oil executives are rewriting the rules. For decades, the global oil system operated under the shadow of OPEC, with Saudi Arabia at the helm, often aligned, at least loosely, with US interests. But the world is shifting, and Riyadh is reading the signs. The petrodollar, once the cornerstone of Saudi-American relations, is showing cracks. And while the Saudis may not be ready to burn that bridge, they're clearly exploring new paths, and one of those leads directly to Tehran. At the heart of this alliance is a simple, unspoken question. What if we stopped letting the United States dictate the value of our resources? What if the markets responded not to Wall Street speculation, but to political decisions made in Riyadh, Tehran, Caracas, and Moscow? It's a bold question, dangerous even, but it's no longer hypothetical, and it's not just Iran and Saudi Arabia. Other oil-producing nations, long marginalized or sanctioned, are gravitating toward this new energy axis. Algeria is stepping up talks with Middle Eastern and Eurasian partners. Venezuela, freshly emboldened by quiet deals with China and Russia, is offering itself as a symbol of resistance. Even smaller players like Nigeria and Angola are paying close attention, watching to see whether this momentum becomes a movement. The psychology behind it is powerful. For years, many of these nations were forced into economic submission. They were told where to sell, how much to produce, what currency to use, and who was allowed to buy. Now the Petro Alliance is saying, enough. It's not just about economics, it's about dignity, about rewriting decades of imbalance and reclaiming control over their own wealth. This narrative is powerful because it resonates across ideologies, whether secular or religious, authoritarian or populist. These governments are finding unity in the belief that US dominance must be challenged, and oil is the perfect instrument. It's tangible, it's finite, and it's essential to every modern economy on the planet. Meanwhile, the US is stuck in a difficult position. Retaliating with more tariffs or sanctions risks pushing these countries even closer together. Ignoring the alliance is equally dangerous because it assumes the threat is temporary. But the truth is, something deeper is happening, something structural. The old energy order is being challenged, not just with words, but with coordinated action. Tankers are being rerouted, new contracts are being written, payments are shifting away from dollars. And all of it is happening faster than Washington can counter. Markets have started to reflect the uncertainty. Crude prices are climbing steadily. Hedge funds are repositioning. And in boardrooms across America, executives are having hard conversations about exposure, cost, and risk. The potential fallout isn't limited to energy companies. It hits agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, every sector that depends on stable fuel prices. Even more interesting is how public sentiment is evolving. In countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, what used to be top-down policies are now turning into symbols of national pride. The oil cut isn't seen as aggressive, it's seen as righteous, a defense of sovereignty. In Venezuela, state media is framing the move as part of a global awakening against Western exploitation. These narratives matter because when leaders act with the wind of public opinion at their backs, they act bolder and often more recklessly. The idea of a petro-alliance isn't about forming a new OPEC. It's about forming a new front. A geopolitical coalition built not on ideology, but on shared grievances and the pursuit of autonomy. That's what makes it so unpredictable and so dangerous. It doesn't follow the traditional rules of diplomacy. It doesn't require consensus. All it needs is coordination in key moments. And that's already happening. This growing bloc isn't trying to destroy the global oil system. They're trying to reshape who controls it. And if they succeed, the consequences won't just be economic, they'll be historic. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think this kind of cooperation between rivals will last? Or is it just temporary convenience? Drop a comment with the word realignment if you believe this is the start of something permanent, or type collapse if you think the alliance will fall apart. If you're still following, you're clearly deep into the real story behind global headlines. Like the video, subscribe, and let's keep unraveling this together, because the next move in this power game might be even more unexpected. China and India, silent support or strategic patience. While the world fixates on the oil producers making bold, headline-grabbing moves, something far more subtle and potentially more transformative is unfolding in the East. China and India, the two largest energy consumers among developing economies, haven't joined any formal alliance, haven't cut off supply chains, and haven't made grand statements condemning or supporting the oil retaliation against the United States. And yet, if you look closely, you'll see their fingerprints all over this global shift. They're not leading the charge, they're positioning themselves to benefit from it, in silence, with patience, with strategy. These two giants understand something crucial. Power in the 21st century doesn't always come from confrontation, it comes from leverage. And right now, both China and India are buying more oil than ever before from sanctioned states. Iran, Venezuela, and Russia have all found eager markets in Beijing and New Delhi, often selling their crude at discounted rates that completely bypass traditional Western-controlled channels. These purchases are not simply about price, they are about alignment, about signaling a shift in loyalty, and more importantly, about reshaping the very architecture of global trade. China has long been preparing for this kind of scenario. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, it has extended influence across strategic ports, pipelines, and refineries from Central Asia to Africa. Energy is a cornerstone of this infrastructure strategy. But what most people miss is how China is also building an alternative financial ecosystem to support it. Yuan-based oil contracts, digital payment systems like CIPS as a rival to SWIFT, and massive state-owned banks willing to underwrite deals in high-risk zones, all of this points to one clear goal: escape the dollar, and with it, American influence. India's approach has been less aggressive, more careful, but no less important. Traditionally seen as closer to the West, India is now walking a tightrope, continuing to do business with the US, while quietly expanding ties with alternative suppliers. After the sanctions on Russian oil, India didn't flinch. It ramped up purchases, refined that oil domestically, and even re-exported it in disguised forms. It was a masterclass in diplomatic ambiguity, and it sent a clear message: New Delhi will act in its own interest, not Washington's. This dual movement, China building new systems, India exploiting cracks in old ones, is helping to prop up the very nations retaliating against the US. It gives those countries confidence, it gives them cash flow, and more dangerously for Washington, it gives them options. Because now, cutting off oil to the United States doesn't mean economic suicide. It means rerouting supply to customers who are not only willing but increasingly eager to buy without Western conditions. And yet, the Western media barely touches on this. They prefer the drama of embargoes, the shock of sudden cuts. But the real threat to the US isn't just the oil that's no longer arriving. It's the new system that's quietly taking shape behind the scenes. A system where American sanctions don't have the same bite, where the dollar isn't the only game in town, and where the flow of energy follows politics that Washington can't control. It's this silent support that makes the retaliation campaign more sustainable. Because now Iran doesn't need to bow to IMF pressure. It has a ready buyer in China. Venezuela doesn't have to rely on black market tankers. It has India's refining capacity, and Russia, once isolated by waves of sanctions, has turned eastward with massive pipeline expansions and long-term contracts that stretch well into the next decade. There's also a psychological element at play. When rising powers like China and India participate, however quietly, in a counter-system, it gives legitimacy to the movement. It turns fringe resistance into mainstream recalibration. It's no longer just rogue states acting out. It's the second and third largest economies in the world, signaling, in their own careful way, that the American-led order may no longer be the only one worth following. This shift doesn't happen with a bang. It happens in increments. A new trade deal here, a discrete oil shipment there, a currency agreement that bypasses SWIFT, a statement that doesn't criticize but doesn't condemn either. And over time, the world wakes up to a new reality. Global energy isn't centralized anymore. It's fractured, it's diversified, and it's far less controllable than before. For Washington, this presents a nightmarish scenario, because confronting China or India directly risks massive economic backlash, and yet ignoring their role enables the very system undermining American dominance. It's a trap with no easy exit. And it's a reminder that in today's geopolitical chessboard, silence can be louder than threats. Patience can be more powerful than pressure. This is the new face of global realignment, not with declarations of war or new alliances carved in stone, but with quiet transactions, whispered strategies, and a shared understanding that the world is moving, irrevocably, toward multipolarity. Now it's your turn. Do you think China and India are simply acting in self-interest, or are they actively reshaping the global order? Drop your answer in the comments using either bystanders if you think they're just playing it safe, or architects if you believe they're building a new world from the shadows. And while you're at it, like the video and hit that subscribe button, because what's coming next might just change everything. Washington's shock, Strategic reserves won't last forever. For years, the United States believed it had a safety net, a cushion large enough to absorb any global energy disruption. That cushion is called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, and for decades it was treated as the ultimate insurance policy. But as barrels begin to vanish from American shores and key exporters tighten their grip, a sobering realization is setting in. The SPR was never meant for this. Not for a prolonged, coordinated economic strike, not for an era where former partners turn neutral and neutral actors turn quietly hostile. The United States is running out of easy options, and the reserve, once seen as a symbol of resilience, is starting to look more like a countdown clock. The idea behind the SPR is simple: store hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil in vast underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast, just in case a national emergency requires swift action. And it worked for a long time. During the Gulf War, after hurricanes, and most recently during the oil price shock caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the SPR served as a reliable pressure valve. But now, as Washington confronts not a temporary disruption, but a deliberate, strategic oil retaliation, its limitations are becoming painfully obvious. Oil is not just being withheld, it's being rerouted, redirected, and weaponized. When the first signs of this oil cut appeared, the US responded in the only way it knew how, by tapping into its reserve. At first it seemed like a smart move. Prices briefly stabilized, supply chains adjusted, and public panic was avoided. But the relief didn't last, because this wasn't a crisis that could be solved with a band-aid. It wasn't caused by a natural disaster or a shipping blockage. It was a calculated geopolitical shift, and the SPR, for all its size, was never designed to outlast politics. As the drawdowns continued, alarm bells started ringing among energy analysts and defense experts. The numbers were staggering. By mid-year, the SPR had reached its lowest level in nearly 4 decades. What was once a buffer now felt dangerously thin. And the bigger concern was psychological. If oil-producing nations saw that Washington was burning through its last line of defense, would they be more emboldened to tighten the screws? Inside the Pentagon and the Department of Energy, contingency plans are being reviewed in hushed tones. There's talk of rationing, of invoking the Defense Production Act, even of trying to rebuild diplomatic bridges with nations the US once sanctioned. Meanwhile, oil refiners are quietly preparing for a reality they hoped they'd never face. One where domestic supply isn't just squeezed, but insufficient. The American public, for now, is largely unaware of how close to the edge things are. Gas prices are rising, yes, but the full scope of the crisis has yet to hit home. Inflation is creeping back, shipping costs are increasing, and food prices are subtly climbing, but the narrative hasn't cracked into mainstream awareness. That's by design. The administration doesn't want panic, but markets, investors, and foreign capitals are already calculating what happens if the US can no longer maintain its image of invulnerability. What makes this moment even more complex is the global context. While Washington drains its reserves, countries like China are quietly building theirs. Chinese stockpiles are growing, not shrinking, and that contrast is glaring. One superpower is burning fuel to stay afloat, the other is preparing for a long game. This isn't just about oil, it's about perception, it's about signaling. And right now, the signal coming from the United States is one of desperation, not dominance. Wall Street is beginning to respond. Energy stocks are volatile. Airlines are hedging fuel prices months in advance. Logistics firms are adjusting their routes to avoid price shocks. But the biggest shift is happening in places like Texas and Louisiana, where oil executives are receiving quiet calls from Washington, calls they haven't received in years. There's a growing sense that the federal government may need to incentivize more domestic drilling, even as it faces pressure from climate advocates to move toward renewables. The energy conversation is no longer just about green transition, it's about survival. Yet there's another layer to this crisis. one that ties directly back to the theme we've been unraveling: power. For decades, the SPR gave the US an aura of control. The idea that no matter what happened globally, America had a trump card. But a trump card only works if you don't overplay it. And now, as barrels disappear and the reserve inches toward critically low levels, adversaries are watching. They know the SPR can't last forever. They know that with every drawdown, America's leverage weakens, and they're adjusting their strategies accordingly. What happens when the reserve runs out? That's a question US officials are asking behind closed doors, not just in terms of oil, but in terms of prestige, deterrence, and global credibility. Because once you show the world that your last backup plan is almost empty, you invite boldness, you invite risk, you invite moves that once seemed unthinkable. Let me know what you think. Should the US have saved its reserve, or was it right to use it early? Drop a comment using the word drained if you think it was a mistake, or necessary if you believe it was the only option. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because what's coming next may leave the reserve empty, but the consequences full. A new cartel rising as Washington watches its reserves dwindle and its influence over global oil markets erode. A more unsettling question begins to surface, not just in war rooms and policy briefings, but in energy corridors from Houston to Brussels. Is a new cartel forming? One not built on supply management and production quotas like the traditional OPEC model, but something far more political, far more ideological, and potentially far more disruptive. The signs are emerging slowly, sometimes hidden behind diplomatic smiles or vague communiques, but they're there. Nations once sidelined, sanctioned, or dismissed are beginning to organize, not out of economic necessity, but out of shared defiance. In energy summits that rarely get covered by Western media, new dialogues are taking place. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Algeria, and increasingly even Saudi Arabia are holding quiet, high-level conversations about creating a framework that goes beyond production coordination. It's not about maintaining oil prices within a comfortable range. It's about reshaping who sets the rules. Unlike OPEC, which has historically sought stability in the markets, this emerging bloc is driven by instability, by the idea that chaos, if directed, can be weaponized to weaken the West's grip on the global economy. This new movement doesn't need a formal name. It doesn't require a charter. Its power comes from mutual understanding. The logic is simple. If these countries synchronize their oil strategies, when to cut, when to flood, who to sell to, and in what currency, they can create rolling disruptions that destabilize economies without ever firing a shot. That's the true power of this new cartel model. It's not locked in time zones or offices. It's fluid, reactive, and deeply embedded in each country's broader struggle for sovereignty and retribution. The Western world, for so long accustomed to assuming that oil diplomacy ran through Vienna or Riyadh, is now trying to make sense of this more nebulous structure. Intelligence agencies are tracking conversations, analysts are combing through shipping data, and yet even the most seasoned experts admit we don't fully understand how deep this goes, because unlike previous energy alliances, this one isn't just about maximizing profit. It's about minimizing American influence. You can see it in the patterns. When the United States tries to isolate Iran with renewed sanctions, Iran finds quiet support from Moscow and Beijing. When Venezuela sees its oil embargoes tightened, India steps in to buy. When Russia faces price caps, it turns to alternate shipping routes with logistical assistance from regional partners. Every action by the US is now met not with silence, but with calculated coordination among the very countries it sought to isolate. And now, these countries are beginning to talk openly about trading oil outside the US dollar. This isn't just economic defiance. It's a direct challenge to the petrodollar system that has underpinned American financial power for nearly 50 years. When major producers begin pricing oil in yuan, rupees, or even digital currencies backed by gold, they aren't just bypassing sanctions, they're undermining the foundation of US geopolitical leverage. Washington is starting to realize that its traditional tools, tariffs, embargoes, freezing bank accounts, are losing effectiveness in this new environment. You can't sanction a network you can't map. You can't disrupt a system that doesn't rely on your infrastructure. And you can't dictate terms to nations that are no longer playing your game. This new cartel isn't looking to replace OPEC. It's aiming to overshadow it by using oil not as a tool of economic equilibrium, but as a pressure point to fracture Western unity. And if they succeed, the ripple effects won't just be felt at the pump. They'll reach into elections, food prices, labor markets, even public trust. Because when citizens start asking why their economies are so vulnerable to decisions made in Caracas or Tehran, politicians will be forced to admit a painful truth. They lost control of the system while pretending it was still under their command. And here's where things get even more volatile. The lack of structure in this new alliance makes it unpredictable. It can pivot quickly. It can evolve faster than regulators can respond. It doesn't operate on quarterly meetings. It operates on shared resentment and real-time opportunity. This isn't just an energy bloc. It's a living, shifting response to decades of perceived Western domination. For energy markets, this means we may be entering a new era defined not by balance, but by volatility as a political weapon. A spike in oil prices is no longer just a market anomaly. It's a tactic. A sudden cut in supply isn't a reaction, it's a warning shot. And for the average consumer, this could mean living in a world where fuel prices swing wildly based on secret meetings thousands of miles away. What do you think? Are we watching the birth of a new cartel or just a temporary alliance of convenience? Drop a comment with the word block if you believe this is a coordinated movement, or bluff if you think it's just short-term posturing. And if this chapter opened your eyes to a new layer of this global story, hit like and subscribe, because the next shift in this silent energy war might already be in motion. Europe caught in the crossfire. While much of the spotlight remains fixed on the rising energy front lines between the United States and the retaliating oil exporters, Europe is being quietly dragged into a storm it never fully anticipated. For decades, the European Union has walked a careful tightrope, economically tied to the US, politically dependent on stability, yet critically reliant on energy imports, many of which originate from the very nations now locking horns with Washington. And now, as the oil retaliation escalates, Europe finds itself caught in the crossfire of a battle it didn't start, but one that could deeply reshape its economy, unity, and global positioning. At first glance, it might appear that Europe is insulated. After all, the continent has spent the past few years trying to diversify away from Russian gas, investing in renewables, and expanding strategic partnerships with the Gulf. But beneath those headlines lies a more fragile reality. European energy infrastructure is still recovering from the aftershocks of the war in Ukraine. Storage facilities are strained, transition technologies remain underdeveloped, and worst of all, the continent is facing a dual dependency on American energy policy and on oil flows from increasingly unpredictable producers in the global south. When oil-producing nations began cutting off supply to the US, markets didn't just react domestically. European refiners, traders, and policy planners immediately felt the tremors. Prices surged across the continent. French truckers went on strike. German industrial producers issued warnings about profitability. Italian port authorities began reporting delays and reroutes. In a globalized energy economy, there is no such thing as isolated consequences. Every cut, every delay, every diplomatic snub in one region sets off chain reactions that land squarely in the heart of Europe's economic model, and the timing couldn't be worse. Just as inflation appeared to be stabilizing across the EU and consumer confidence was creeping back post-pandemic, the resurgence of oil price volatility has reignited fears of economic stagnation. Central banks are torn between raising rates to combat inflation and holding back to avoid choking fragile growth. Politicians, meanwhile, are scrambling to control narratives, frame the crisis as external, and delay public panic. But voters aren't blind. They feel the pressure in their monthly bills, in transportation costs, and in food prices that seem to creep upward no matter what reassurances are offered. What makes Europe's position even more complex is its political entanglement with Washington. As the US imposes tariffs and sanctions, and as retaliation ripples outward, EU nations are increasingly being asked, sometimes indirectly, sometimes not, to pick a side. And while the official line remains one of unity and shared democratic values, behind closed doors, frustration is mounting. Several European diplomats have expressed discontent with America's unilateral moves, which often escalate tensions without consulting allies. They're being left to deal with the fallout of a conflict shaped by powers outside their control. In Brussels, some policy architects are even beginning to question the long-term viability of the transatlantic energy strategy. How sustainable is it really for Europe to anchor itself so closely to a US energy system that is increasingly being targeted, undermined, and bypassed? Should the EU be doing more to establish its own energy diplomacy, one that balances partnerships with the US and also fosters strategic neutrality with oil-producing regions? These questions aren't just academic, they're urgent. Because if Europe remains reactive, it risks becoming the primary economic casualty of a geopolitical tug-of-war it never chose. Meanwhile, populist movements across the continent are seizing the moment. Rising prices and supply instability offer the perfect storm for political opportunism. In Spain, Italy, Hungary, and even France, opposition parties are framing the energy crisis as proof that current leadership is too aligned with American interests, too blind to the need for a more independent European foreign policy. The energy crisis is being weaponized, not just in pipelines and refineries, but in parliaments, protests, and primetime news panels. And if this political unrest continues to spread, the EU could face not just economic strain, but internal fragmentation. There's also the looming question of how long European industries can withstand the pressure. Sectors like steel, chemicals, and automotive manufacturing, pillars of the continent's economic engine, are extremely sensitive to energy costs. If oil prices continue to spike or fluctuate unpredictably, companies may be forced to shift operations, lay off workers, or relocate production entirely. This could accelerate deindustrialization trends already threatening parts of Central and Eastern Europe, deepening inequality between member states and challenging the very cohesion of the Union. All of this is unfolding as European leaders prepare for a new wave of elections, local, national, and EU-wide. The stakes are higher than ever, because the decisions made now, in the context of this energy retaliation, will define whether Europe emerges as a more resilient, strategically autonomous force, or whether it becomes collateral damage in a larger struggle between oil-rich nations and the West. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Should Europe break away from American energy strategies and pursue its own path? Or would that create even more division and vulnerability? Drop your comment using the word independent if you think Europe should chart its own energy course, or aligned if it should stand with the US, no matter the cost. And if you're still with me, like the video and subscribe, because the next part of this story dives even deeper into the ripple effects you're not hearing about anywhere else. Backlash at home. American industry on edge. As the international drama unfolds and oil-producing nations tighten the screws in retaliation against US tariffs, the consequences are no longer just playing out on foreign soil or in diplomatic backchannels. They're now echoing loudly through the corridors of American factories, trucking depots, airline headquarters, and farm fields. The illusion that this was a distant geopolitical chess match is officially shattered. American industry, once shielded by global dominance and supply chain security, is beginning to show signs of deep stress, and the fallout is coming faster than many anticipated. The first signs of pressure emerged in the transportation sector. Long considered the heartbeat of the US economy, the trucking industry is feeling an unprecedented squeeze. Diesel prices have spiked sharply since the first coordinated oil export cuts, and fleets across the country are burning through cash reserves just to stay on the road. Independent truckers are being pushed to the brink, with some choosing to park their rigs entirely. Trucking firms that handle large-scale logistics for food distribution, medical supplies, and manufacturing components are warning clients that delivery schedules are being adjusted, not because of demand, but because fuel costs are eating into operating margins. Airlines are facing an equally punishing reality. Jet fuel costs have surged, and route planning has become a complex balancing act between fuel efficiency and revenue. Carriers that were just starting to recover from the pandemic's economic hit are now bracing for a potential wave of cancellations, reduced flight frequency, and ticket price increases that could further suppress consumer demand. The travel rebound narrative has shifted. Now the focus is survival, not expansion. But the real alarm bells are ringing in sectors that depend on energy, not just for transportation, but as an essential part of production. American manufacturing, already facing global competition and rising labor costs, is confronting an energy cost spike that threatens to upend entire business models. In states like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, traditional industrial hubs, steel makers, auto manufacturers, and chemical plants are reporting that rising oil and gas prices are forcing them to delay expansion plans, cut back on output, or pass costs directly to consumers. Agriculture isn't immune either. Fertilizers, equipment, and irrigation systems all depend on petroleum-based inputs or diesel-powered machinery. For farmers already struggling with extreme weather events and volatile commodity markets, the added burden of skyrocketing fuel costs is devastating. The price of moving food from field to shelf is going up, and so is the price of the food itself. For many Americans, that translates to higher grocery bills, empty shelves in smaller towns, and growing public anger aimed not just at oil-exporting nations, but at a political system that seems incapable of responding quickly enough. Behind all of this is a broader psychological shift. For decades, American consumers operated with the implicit belief that energy security was a given, that no matter what happened abroad, the US could always rely on domestic production or friendly imports to stabilize supply. That belief is eroding fast. The sense of invincibility, of always having a buffer, is being replaced with something much more volatile: uncertainty. And in an economy built on consumer confidence, uncertainty is poison. Wall Street is already adjusting. Investors are shifting away from sectors exposed to transportation and heavy manufacturing. Hedge funds are betting on prolonged volatility in energy futures. Even tech companies, which once considered energy prices a background concern, are beginning to reassess risk exposure for data centers, logistics, and hardware manufacturing. When fuel becomes unpredictable, every part of the economic system becomes vulnerable. That's the invisible thread. Energy connects everything. Yet what's perhaps most troubling for policymakers is that the tools they usually turn to in times of crisis are either unavailable or ineffective. Subsidies might help certain sectors temporarily, but they don't address the root problem. The supply cuts are deliberate and politically motivated. Tax relief can ease consumer pressure, but it doesn't make diesel cheaper or refill the strategic petroleum reserve. Diplomatic outreach might slow the escalation, but at this point, many of the retaliating nations seem more interested in testing America's limits than making quick deals. This is where the internal backlash begins to take shape. Across the country, Workers are organizing, business leaders are lobbying, and everyday citizens are beginning to ask hard questions. Why weren't we better prepared for an energy squeeze like this? Why are we so dependent on foreign oil when we boast about energy independence? And perhaps most damning of all, what if this is just the beginning? The political consequences are already bubbling. Governors in energy-intensive states are calling for federal action. Congressional hearings are being planned, presidential approval ratings are slipping, and in communities that voted for economic renewal, the feeling of déjà vu from past oil crises is hard to ignore. Americans are waking up to the fact that energy retaliation isn't just a foreign policy story. It's a domestic economic shock that's already reshaping their lives. So what do you think? Are U.S. industries being abandoned in a larger geopolitical game, or are these just growing pains on the road to energy resilience? Drop a comment using the word abandoned if you think the government isn't doing enough, or resilient if you believe this is a necessary challenge to build long-term strength. And if you're still with me, like the video and subscribe, because in the next part, we're diving into the deeper global game being played behind this oil retaliation, and it's far more calculated than most people realize. The real game, shifting the global power balance. As fuel prices climb, industries tighten, and supply chains stretch to their limits, what's truly unfolding beneath all the headlines isn't just an energy crisis. It's a radical transformation of the global balance of power. What started as a reaction to tariffs, framed as retaliation from a handful of oil-producing nations, has rapidly evolved into a sophisticated geopolitical strategy. This is not just about punishing Washington for economic pressure. It's about something far more ambitious, challenging the architecture of the post-World War II world order and laying the groundwork for a multipolar system where U.S. influence is no longer the defining force. The nations involved in cutting or redirecting oil supplies have more in common than their petroleum exports. They share a long history of being dictated to by institutions rooted in Western dominance, whether the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NATO, or the petrodollar system. And now, perhaps for the first time since the Cold War, they see a real chance to push back, not just with words or diplomatic gestures, but with measurable disruption. Energy is the vehicle, but the destination is something deeper: sovereignty, autonomy, and relevance on the global stage. We're witnessing a chess game with high stakes, and oil is just one of the pieces. The real play is unfolding in how these nations are reconfiguring their roles in global finance, trade, defense, and influence. For decades, the United States sat at the center of every key decision about who could sell what, to whom, and under what terms. That centrality gave Washington not just power, but control. Now, that control is slipping. You can see it in the quiet rise of non-dollar oil deals. Saudi Arabia, once unthinkable as anything but a staunch petrodollar ally, has begun experimenting with pricing some of its oil in yuan. Russia, in defiance of sanctions, has normalized oil trade with India using rupees and barter agreements. Iran is exploring gold-backed digital tokens as a way to bypass banking restrictions. These shifts, though incremental, are cumulative, and they represent a deep desire to decenter the dollar, to break free from a system where American financial institutions act as global gatekeepers. At the same time, military posturing is evolving. Russia is deepening security ties with Iran through drone and missile technology exchanges. China is conducting joint naval exercises with Gulf countries. Turkey is quietly repositioning itself as a diplomatic broker between East and West, leveraging its energy access as a strategic chip. This rebalancing isn't just economic, it's defense-related, cultural, and technological. And in this environment, every barrel of oil rerouted, every new bilateral trade agreement that avoids the US banking system, becomes a small yet significant strike in a much larger conflict. What makes this so dangerous for the current global system is the speed with which these changes are occurring. The United States spent decades building an empire of influence based on slow, steady institutional consolidation. What's happening now is rapid, agile, and hard to predict. There's no central command, no manifesto, just a growing consensus among nations that they no longer want to be constrained by the structures America built. And the oil retaliation is simply the most visible manifestation of this broader realignment. Meanwhile, Washington is stuck in a reactive posture. It is trying to manage symptoms without acknowledging the root cause, that its unipolar dominance is no longer seen as legitimate or beneficial by a large portion of the world. By using sanctions and tariffs as routine tools, it may have unwittingly accelerated the very backlash now unfolding. The more it punishes, the more incentive it gives for the punished to organize. And now those marginalized voices are beginning to harmonize. Even American allies are starting to hedge. France has raised concerns about overdependence on the dollar in global trade. Germany is exploring alternative energy partnerships with countries outside the NATO umbrella. South Korea and Japan, traditional US security partners, are being courted by China with trade incentives. The fabric of alliance is still intact, but it's being stretched, and once it frays, it won't be easily repaired. The implications of this moment go far beyond oil. They touch every aspect of how power is projected and sustained. If energy flows can be weaponized without triggering direct military conflict, then financial systems, media influence, supply chains, and even cultural exports are fair game. We may be entering a world where hard power, tanks, missiles, armies, is replaced by economic pressure points, psychological influence, and strategic disruption. This is why the current energy conflict shouldn't be seen in isolation. It's not just a price war, it's not just about tariffs, it's a signal flare for a new phase of global politics, a moment where empires aren't collapsing, but morphing. Where smaller powers, long considered irrelevant in the grand game, are discovering leverage they never knew they had, and they're learning how to use it, not with loud proclamations, but with quiet, coordinated moves that shift the weight of the system 1 inch at a time. So what do you think? Is this the start of a new global order, or just temporary chaos before things return to normal? Let me know in the comments. Type reset if you believe the power balance is permanently shifting, or rebound if you think the US will regain control. And if you've made it this far, you already know this story is deeper than any headline. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned, because what comes next will expose how far this realignment could truly go. If you've made it this far, we truly want to know, how did this video speak to your heart? Take a moment and comment below. I liked the content, and share how this message resonated with you personally. Your voice matters, and your perspective helps us build a community grounded in truth, awareness, and purpose. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on these powerful and eye-opening insights. Leave a like to support this mission of bringing clarity to complex global issues, and make sure to watch the next video, already waiting for you on the end screen. May God bless your life abundantly and guide you through every challenge with wisdom and strength. We appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next one.